You know, putting the name Jesus Christ in the same sentence with cultural reformer or maybe cultural activist sounds pretty crazy. And it certainly wasn't Jesus' mission, not at all. But in the process of doing what Father wanted him to do, that is exactly what happened. So how do I come up with Jesus the cultural reformer? It does sound crazy. But you have to realize the culture that he lived in and how crazy that was. You see, in the New Testament, you read about Sadducees and Pharisees. But that's only skimming across the surface of the story. Jesus Christ's ministry was to Israel, so you would think he would ignore everybody except Pharisees and Sadducees. Pretty much true. But that doesn't mean that that's all the culture consisted of. Not at all. Starting with Abraham, who was called the first Hebrew, they developed a culture that was a one-God culture, which made it unique in the Middle East, because while they shared a lot of cultural procedures and common ground and even languages, the Hebrew culture was unique. And it survived all the way through up to about 325 BC, or BCE to be politically correct. And that's when Alexander conquered what was Persia, formerly had been Babylon, and they introduced the Greek culture and language, architecture and artwork and statues into Judea. And then Alexander died not long after that, a couple of years, and the Judea fell under one of his generals from the Egyptian Empire. It became the Seleucid Empire, if you want to look it up in history. And then they had another war, and Syria wound up running Judea. Well, Syria was much more intrusive than the Egyptians had been. So Syrians put up a statue in the temple, and that led to a revolt, and Israel gained its independence. Well, about that time, which was around 165 BCE, along comes the Pharisees and approach the new king of Israel and suggested a national education system. Now, that's the first time the Pharisees are mentioned, but they must have existed as a fairly large group long before that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to petition the king to set up a national education system. The national education system was known as the synagogues. And there they would teach literacy in the traditional Hebrew language, Hebrew. They would also teach Moses and the prophets, and they would teach whatever was in Israel's self-interest, actually. But there was a problem there in that in the temple you had Sadducees, which were the descendants of Zadok, the first high priest appointed by King Solomon, and they didn't really pay a lot of attention to Moses except for the parts that dealt with the practice of sacrifices and giving and the heave offerings and the this and the that and so forth. So they weren't really students of the Hebrew Bible. But you might consider them the conservatives. And then there was the liberal branch of what's become known as Judaism, and that was the Pharisees. They were very well educated, but also philosophical. They tended to interpret Moses in an allegorical sort of way, and also to stay within the framework of what Moses required for behavior. They added and added and added procedures and rules, and then they twisted Moses to interpret Moses, especially the prophets, to say something that they didn't really. And then, on top of that, they added their cultural precedents. They call them precedents. In other words, we've been doing this for a long time, so now it's the same as the law as Moses. Well, if you understand culture, you know that culture is sort of passed along through two ways. One is, I'd call it osmosis. You kind of pick it up from your friends and your neighbors and your family. And the other is through education. So the Pharisees had corrupted the culture, that old Hebrew culture. They'd corrupted it with all of their changes and additions and their liberal thinking and their allegorical interpretations and their cultural habits and all that stuff. Well, on top of that, you also have some other groups not mentioned in the Gospels, is the Essenes, who kind of squirreled themselves away up in, I forget the name of that place. And but if you know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, you know that that was part of their library. And then there were Zealots. How does Zealots fit in? Well, in 63 BCE, the Romans conquered Israel, or the lands of Judea, and put them under Roman law, and now we had the influx of Latin as a language, and then we had the influx of Roman rule, Roman organization, and especially Roman taxes. So the Zealots wanted to overthrow Rome violently. So now you've got Essenes, Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots. What a mess. So Jesus Christ comes on the scene. He has a mission from God. And what he does is he teaches pure Moses. He strips off the corruptions of the Pharisees. He strips off their additions, their precedents, their cultural norms, all those extra things that were put on Moses and the prophets. He is so successful that the people who followed his teachings became known as another sect of Judaism. They were called the Nazarenes, or those who followed the teacher from Nazareth. So how did he do that? Well, John the Baptist came on the scene in the spirit of Elijah. He had great power, great influence, and he was preaching, prepare for the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of God, which is the same thing if you understand Hebrew culture. And he was very popular. Thousands got baptized and followed him. So then what happens? Well, he lost his head. Herod beheaded him, even though he liked him, because he had to keep a promise to his, I forget, his niece or something. And then the people that followed John the Baptist began to follow Jesus, and Jesus' ministry took on a big prominence. Now, when Jesus sent out the 70, he told them to go to Israel. When he sent out his 12 apostles, he told them to go to Israel. Why? Because it was Israel's culture had been corrupted. They had lost track of getting ready for their Messiah. They had lost track of getting ready for the entrance of the kingdom of God. They'd lost track of being ready. And he had to get them ready. He had to reteach Moses so they would understand what Moses and the prophets and the writings said about him. I think you call that reactionary, where you revert back to a former more pure cultural system. Well, his movement became so popular that he essentially changed the culture. He really did. It wasn't the plan to be a cultural reformer, but that's what happened. So how do I come up with he taught pure Moses instead of teaching something new? Well, there's a passage in Matthew 23 where the Pharisees are there and he's teaching, and you've got a conflict of Pharisees and Jesus followers and Jesus, and he says something kind of odd. I think it's in the second verse. But he says, they sit on the seat of Moses, do as they say, but do not do as they do, because they say and do not do. Don't do what they say because they don't do it themselves. Now that's been confusing to all modern theologians and Christians and historians. But the answer actually lies in the Hebrew. There is a text, a Hebrew text of Matthew, and all the scholars pretty much agree that Matthew was probably written originally in Hebrew, and then this text was handed down and copied over, and yeah, it's suffered some abuse, and some, when manuscripts get hard to read, they kind of take a peek at the Greek and see what to do with it. But in the Matthew 23, in the second verse, it reads very differently from English. What it says is that the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses, do as he says, Moses says, but don't do as the Pharisees say. Well, that makes perfect sense in the context, because following is 13 indictments of the Pharisees where they say and don't do. So what did Jesus teach? Pure Moses. Pure Moses. That's what I call it. He was bringing the culture back, at least the culture of his followers, back to their original position. The scholars are also beginning to come around to the notion that Jesus may have preached in Hebrew, because it was well known that Hebrew was the language in the synagogues, because they were taught literacy of Moses, and all those old manuscripts are written in Hebrew. So Jesus is purifying the culture by throwing off the lackadaisicalness of the Sadducees and the liberal interpretations of the Pharisees. And it wasn't hard to get rid of the Sadducees. The Sadducees had so been engulfed by Greek culture that if you'll notice when they're named the high priest names, they're not even Hebrew names, they're Greek. I read in one historical book that said the Sadducees were Hebrews by day in the temple, and by night they would drink and joke with the Greeks, and you couldn't tell Hebrews from Greeks at night. That's partly why they weren't highly respected in Israel. But the Pharisees were, because they were well educated. It's just that they were Christians. So Jesus was a cultural reformer. So there you have it.